Hey, good afternoon. This is Phil Browning Helsel from Austin Seminary. I'm talking today about the second part of Chanequa Walker Barnes' book, I Bring the Voices of My People, a womanist vision for racial reconciliation. And in the first video, we talked through the introduction, Chapter 1, Racism is not about feeling or friendships. Chapter 2, Racism is not a standalone issue. And now we're going to turn to Chapter 3, the unbearable whiteness of being. So, Dr. Walker Barnes says, who gets to be white is what global racism is all about. Historically, people tried to claim whiteness, yet there was resistance to naming it. She discusses how people talk about white privilege as something you could pick up or put down, as if simply claiming or identifying white privilege is enough to remove it. But she says whiteness, quote, whiteness is not something people possess, but it's something that possesses them, end quote, on page 116. And she underscores how to be white is to be free. That's in the definition of being white. And so freedom becomes a central concern for everyone who's excluded from that category. She talks about Nell Painter's book, History of White People, where she discusses how the Greeks made racial distinctions denoting racial purity. And during the 11th century, distinctions emerged between white and other slaves. And white took over where Christian had been used. By the end of the 19th century, there was a four-part scheme: Anglo-Saxons, Germans, Irish Catholic, and other Europeans. And then African Americans. Asians and Native Americans were omitted from this scheme. She says she's really perplexed as to why there's been little discussion of the impact of slaveholding on whites or white identity. So she wonders, given the rise of scholarship after the Holocaust, how is it that whites have not been preoccupied by the question of slavery as the central theological question? And she discusses a little bit how in the South, slaveholding and religiosity went together. Frederick Douglass talked about how he wouldn't have wanted to be under a religious slave master, because to be there would be being oppressed on both hands by God and also by the institution of slavery. So what's the history of white supremacy within the history of white Christianity? She discusses De Wolf's movie Traces of the Trade, and discusses what does it mean to participate in a system that you know is wrong. It looks a lot like moral injury for her, which includes a betrayal of what's right by someone who holds legitimate authority in a high-stakes situation. So then there's a moral dissonance. But if the self can't handle that moral dissonance, then there's a kind of a high degree of shutting off of the self from broader consciousness, which creates a distortion in mental processing. She says on page 128, quote, "At the heart of whiteness is a great moral injury," end quote. So the inculturation into whiteness then requires receiving a mirror wound of racism into the self, she says on page 128. Daniel Hill wants to use the word moral sickness to describe the word whiteness. A shame perpetrator reaction, not a fear victim reaction. So she notices how white strategies in anti-racism tend to diminish the involvement of the church and its leaders in order to distance and demonize themselves, their slaveholding ancestors. There's a reluctance of white Americans, she notices overall, to identify themselves as white. So she'll try in her work with students to get students to identify as white, and list 5 positive qualities related to whiteness. The difficulty that they have of both identifying as white and then talking about 5 positive qualities related to whiteness is, for Dr. Walker Barnes, a sign of a profound moral injury. Indeed, there's kind of a stopping of thinking that happens. She says on page 135, it's as if the capacity for critical thinking and reflection, reflective discussion disappears among white people when racism comes up, end quote, on page 135. So she says, white people's response to racism is a manifestation of the moral injury that comes when whites, that keeps whites from caring about persons of color. So race is this constant process for Dr. Walker Barnes of making up people, being made white. Whiteness then becomes a matter of conforming to community ideals. And she talks a little bit about how whites have divided themselves into classes, including middle-class whites scapegoating poor whites. She describes the kind of characteristics of middle-class whites: being judgmental, defensive, competitive, status-oriented, valuing formal education, having a perceived right to comfort, time urgency, belief in a right way, emotional restraint, either-or thinking, social etiquette, or being nice, end quote, on page 139. So these are the qualities that she identifies as middle-class whiteness or upper-class whiteness. She says that whites need to explore how race has shaped their identities and their values. The idea that the social justice, the idea that a social justice framework, the idea that there's a socially just world and that it belongs to you, or that you have a right to comfort or freedom from harm, she says is a particular characteristic of whiteness. And she also notices how white people don't want to talk about it. There's this kind of peculiar muteness that comes over white people when it comes to talking about race. And she says, again, this is the psychological splitting that occurred under slavery. After the 1960s, people just stopped talking about whiteness altogether. And so the idea then is that maybe one idea here is that whiteness is that race is only pertinent to non-whites. This might be an idea that whites have. There's also kind of an ego-ethnocentrism, she calls it, lurking behind this, an assumption that one's own culture is better, along with not wanting to feel uncomfortable or feel attacked. And she does a really nice job with a creative fable that shows all whites are complicit in racism. I encourage you to take a look at that as well. So a difficult, a challenging, and ultimately hopeful chapter by Dr. Walker Barnes. The Unbearable Whiteness of Being. Chapter 4, Reconciliation Begins with a Curse. This begins with a discussion of the color purple. And one character in the color purple, Celie, says, she says to her partner, Albert, until you do right by me, everything will fail. So she curses her partner, Albert. And she says that a similar curse is operative until whites do right by persons of color. So this is really the crucial piece of the reparations or restitution part of reconciliation for Dr. Walker Barnes. She looks at how an order of kind of silencing takes over in this story that she quotes, The Color Purple by Alice Walker. And these same institutions that silence this abused woman are also the same institutions that maintain white supremacy, she says. So she quotes Bell Hooks, who says that she was taught to talk in a speech that was a silence, so a speech that didn't say anything, in order to protect herself. And she talks about being positioned as deceitful, untrustworthy, and incapable of innocence. The healing then in The Color Purple is in relationship to God, as Celie recovers a voice of lament through letters that she writes to God. And having a witness in Shug helps Seeley to release that internalized oppression and become sex positive again. Then she stops writing to God after a while, and Walker Barnes interprets this as positive as well. She says she says now she thinks of God differently, as a God who would want her to delight in the color purple as she passed by it in the field. So her confrontation with Albert, this curse, unless you do right by me, is really in Walker Barnes's hands the gift of the Spirit, which is a call to truth-telling in racism. So we tend to protect abusers, but we tend to protect perpetrators of racism. But we need to confess, confront, and resist these images of God that lie behind so much of this discourse. And ultimately, Dr. Walker Barnes believes that the cross has a reconciling power to address the severe impact of internalized oppression. She talks about Desmond Tutu, his statement that racism makes people doubt that they are children of God. But Seeley's healing begins in her first instance of her letter to God, when she's then addressing herself to someone who can give a different source of identity. In the process, she transforms her beliefs about what she should be. And so a political freedom is kind of at the end of this process. Learning itself is an act of salvation, and this includes restoration to the victim herself. It starts with an individuation or defining the self in networks of mutual support. So the moral repair that comes after racism must include a coming to voice, validation, and attempts to repair. And she notices that in the United States, there's been no large-scale attempts to help persons of color name their truths, like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. And she talks about Cherie Moraga and Gloria Anzaldúa eventually leaving a national feminist organization because they wouldn't recognize their concerns as women of color. But she says women of color actually are likely to stay too long in toxic institutions that don't make space for them. And this movement out of institutions can be a gift as well. So when Seeley left Albert and she cursed him, "Until you do right by me, everything you do will fail," Albert had to learn to listen to his own heart, and this was in a form of repentance or shift, what William James called a shift of the habitual center of one's being. So repentance must bear fruit in terms of reversals of racism, or else white people become agents of the evil one, she says on page 192. So unless there's real change in people's lives, then it's kind of a cheap grace ultimately. And people's confession and their repentance are not complete, but rather they're refusing to engage in their responsibility. She gives an example of de Kock in South Africa, insisting he was just following orders. So she turns now to an idea of a beloved community drawn from Josiah Royce and Martin Luther King, also influential on Howard Thurman. The idea from the beloved community is the impartiality of God, the earth belonging to God, the dignity and worth of the human personality, and then solidarity of society and world. So building a new community then requires the transformation of all people. Celia, like Christ, she says, bears the wounds of suffering transformation in her meeting with Shug. And then she discusses how women's voices then need to be central in this process. The goal of racial reconciliation is not hugging on stage, but intentional, is not two men, a white man and an African-American man hugging on stage, but an intentional, here's a quote for you, an intentional, sustained, and large-scale effort to remediate the economic, educational, political, social, physical, and psychological harms inflicted on persons of color by racism, end quote, page 200. So repentance, conversion, and reparations are the key ideas here. But the ultimate notion that she holds is that The difference of race is a reminder of God's wanting people not to be alone, but be together across differences. So building beloved community doesn't require abolishing race, but rather white supremacy and the establishment of racial justice. So Jubilee requires giving up what you have. Prevailing models of racial reconciliation, she says, fall far from getting us there in terms of this deeper restorative notion she has. So ultimately, our notions of reconciliation shouldn't make us forget slavery or act as if we're not being cut to the quick by it. Reconciliation involves healing the disruptions in the self. And it begins with this curse that says, until you do right by me, everything that you do will fail. Okay, the final chapter, chapter 5, are spiritual strivings. So Dr. Walker Barnes says, she quotes from Zora Neale Hurston, who says, even they seemed to be striving in the dark, but their eyes were watching God. So here she's going to conclude this book with another deep and nuanced look at race. So not a triumphal conclusion. She says, even when relationships are restored, power imbalances remain. But she says the aim of racial justice includes efforts to redress psychological wounds and the relational impact of racism. And here she turns eschatological too. She says we have to turn to the mission of God to restore a broken world. Because of this, because God is actively involved in restoring people harmed by racism, then we have to cooperate with God in this work for justice. This reconciliation becomes part of the gospel. So she turns to Cone, who says the only Christian imagination that's real that really works has to be shaped by the lynching tree. So we need a moment of confession in regards to racism, and then ongoing public confessions. She notes, interestingly, that lament is almost missing from American Christianity, but it constitutes 40% of all psalms, and it's remarkably underrepresented in the mainline hymns. And so maybe this instance of lament could take us back to Seeley's letters to God that were full of lament. Love and friendship in the language of racial reconciliation movements can also be manipulative, she said, to a kind of silent complicity. But instead, she invites us to reorient ourselves to God's grace, which honors the pool of tears beside each individual, and the Sabbath, which reorients us towards God and God's time, so that our work becomes a reflection of God's work. So she talks about trying to do things for the liberations of others, not the self. So our eyes watching God means that we dream with God. So ultimately, Dr. Walker Barnes says that the only way to do racial reconciliation work is to start with the experience of women. And the experience of women of color, she says, teaches us, as we look through their eyes, the multiple forms of violence that are committed against them, but also the ways, a path towards healing and reconciliation. So reconciliation isn't the ultimate word. Well, it's not a word about friendship. It's a word about transforming the conditions that have led to the devastating harms of racism. So in this book, Dr. Chanequa Walker Barnes gives a deep and profound analysis of the impacts of racism on women of color and how their women of color's distinctive, particularly womanist framework, then gives guidelines to deepening the process of racial reconciliation away from some of its what she calls her less helpful responses. What I loved about this book was that ultimately the work of reconciliation is in God's hands, and joining it becomes a sign of our involvement in God's ultimate mission to transform the world. And I also really learned a lot from the discussion of the kinds of double oppressions of patriarchy and racism on women of color in terms of their internalized self-worth and some of the images that they take into themselves about beauty and standards of beauty and perfection. So this, I highly recommend this book, Dr. Chanequa Walker-Barnes' book, I Bring the Voices of My People, A Womanist Vision for Racial Reconciliation. And this was published in 2019 from Erdman's. And I'm going to use it this term in my Introduction to Pastoral Care class. All right, so thank you so much for watching this video.